Okay, so let's just get started. It's 4:30. We've got lots to think about, lots to talk about, and we have a distinguished panel here to help us think. I want to first of all welcome you all. My name is Jennifer Walters. I'm Dean of Religious Life here at Smith and also the Director of the Center for Community Collaboration. I want to thank Alice Hurst, the Chair of the Government Department, for her swift work in inviting a terrific panel of faculty, whom I'll introduce in a moment. Also want to thank you to the Faculty Lecture Fund, who is supporting this, as well as Jolandi Cruz, Kim Alston, Matilda Cantwell from the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life, who helped us organize this also. And just so that you know, there's some things, these are outside. This is an initiative of the Center for Religious and Spiritual Life to keep the conversation going, not to be merely a conversation, but to move forward with action and reflection. So there'll be opportunities to continue in a week or so. So it's going to be 30 days tomorrow since Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American teenager, was shot dead in the street in his neighborhood in Ferguson, Missouri, by Darren Wilson, a white Ferguson police officer. Michael Brown's death has sparked emotion, action, thinking, and soul-searching about police and law enforcement practices, the paramilitarization of police forces, and racialized justice system more broadly. It's raised questions about how and when force or intimidation is or should be used by police, and who gets to walk down the middle of the street in their own neighborhood. The urgency of these questions is reinforced by the United Nations. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a report just weeks ago finding that the U.S. has failed to comply with its international commitments to end racial discrimination. Specifically, the report cites the use of racial profiling, militarized approaches to policing, and racial disparities in education. Last week, U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder announced a civil rights investigation into the broader circumstances of Brown's killing, including the recruitment, training, law enforcement strategies, and the use of excessive force by police in Ferguson and St. Louis County more broadly. In the last 30 days, people have come together in person and on social media to talk, to march, to cry, to think in fresh ways about next steps. What does a panel discussion at Smith College have to offer? In her column in the most recent issue of The Nation, Smith professor Paula Giddings looks to history, and she notes that the rise of lynching in the late 19th century brought black women to the center of anti-racist work because women saw the struggles for dignity and freedom of men and women as connected. Or as Audre Lorde observed, there's no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not live single-issue lives. We come together as a college community from many different backgrounds and social locations because we must uphold the freedom and dignity of every human being. There is no more important work, and this is one part of that work. We have a great panel of scholars to think about Ferguson and the implications of it with us. And if you want to think about next steps, as I said, you can look for information on Smith Media and also just take one of these flyers as you leave, as one step anyway. Today's format will go as follows. I will introduce our moderator and panelists very briefly, and then Professor Barnes, our moderator, will give an overview of some news reports about the Ferguson situation. Panelists will weigh in briefly, and then we'll have a discussion from there. You've been given or received cards, index cards that you can write a question on if you want to ask the panel a question. Some of you have paper. I should have thought you could text me, but I'm not going to give you my phone number. But we'll figure this out. And then in about an hour, we'll be going around to kind of collect your questions so we can move forward with question and answers. Today's moderator is Rishay Barnes, Assistant Professor in Afro-American Studies here at Smith College. She earned degrees from Spelman College, Georgia State University, and a doctorate in anthropology from Emory. Professor Barnes specializes in race, class, and gender dynamics in African-American families as they're experienced in the U.S. political economy, Race and Identity Formation Across the African Diaspora, and Black Women's Articulations of Feminism. Her research and publications have focused on cultural shifts in Black women's perceptions of career and family in the US and abroad, and is currently working on a manuscript that explores Black women's career and family gender strategies as they are rooted in class, position, and racial identity. To her right is James Smethurst, a professor of Afro-American Studies at UMass Amherst. He received his PhD in English from Harvard University. Professor Smethurst is the author of several books about African-American literature and literary culture, including The New Red Negro, The Literary Left in African-American Poetry, 1930 to 1946, The Black Arts Movement, Literary Nationalism in the 1960s and 1970s, and The African-American Roots of Modernism, Reconstruction to the Harlem Renaissance. His scholarly interests are wide-ranging and include African-American literature and culture, 20th century poetry, 19th and 20th century American literature, ethnic studies, film, music, and popular culture. He is currently working on a history of the Black arts movement in the South and is co-editing SOS, Calling All Black People, a Black Arts Reader, with John Bracey and Sonia Sanchez. To his right is Samuel Kelton Roberts, an associate professor of history at Columbia University, an associate professor of socio-medical sciences at Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia. Roberts earned his degrees at the University of Virginia and Princeton. He received a PhD in history. Professor Roberts is the policy coordinator for a new Columbia University criminal justice initiative involving the schools of arts and sciences, journalism, law, education, nursing, and social work. He's also the director of the Institute for Research in African American Studies. He writes, teaches, and lectures widely on African American history, medical and public health history, urban history, and the history of social movements. To his right is Christina Greer, an assistant professor of political science at Fordham University. Professor Greer earned degrees at Tufts University and a PhD in political science from Columbia University. Her research and teaching focus on American politics, Black ethnic politics, urban politics, quantitative methods, Congress, New York City, and New York State politics. Her book, Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream, investigates the increasingly ethnically diverse Black populations in the US from Africa to the Caribbean and the Caribbean. Her scholarship also explores criminal activity and political responses in Boston and Baltimore. And Professor Greer is currently writing her second manuscript on the history of African Americans who have run for the executive office in the United States. And finally, to her right is Christopher Tinson, assistant professor of African American Studies at Hampshire College. He earned degrees at San Francisco State University and California State University, Dominguez Hills, and his PhD is from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. His interdisciplinary research and teaching focus on the intersections between Africana radical traditions, US ethnic studies, hip-hop culture, critical media studies, incarceration, community-based education, race, and sports. His writings have been published in The Black Scholar, the Journal of African American History, The Nation, and Radical Teacher. He's conducted workshops at various college campuses, high schools, and juvenile detention centers in this area, and serves as a youth mentor. Since 2006, he's hosted Trigger Radio, a hip-hop-rooted social justice radio program. We have a wealth of wisdom and knowledge on this panel, and I will turn everything over to Professor Barnes and the panel.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, President McCartney, and thank you to everyone who's here this evening and everyone who's listening in. I, for one, really appreciate the fact that we have a campus where this type of conversation can happen and can potentially lead us into deeper exploration and deeper conversation and hopefully some action. around these issues and the history of these issues. I'm going to start, as Dean Walters suggested, with a bit of a timeline of sorts that comes out of some of the news reports. And the purpose for that is to kind of make sure that everyone is on the same page as best as possible with what has been going on, what has led us to this particular conversation, and why we would even think to privilege this particular encounter. It's not the only one, it's not the first one, and so we need to kind of have a conversation also about why this particular situation. So on Saturday, August 9th, officers encountered Michael Brown and a friend as they were walking down a street, according to news reports. Michael Brown at that time was shot, and there are discrepancies about how that actually happened. There are some reports that say he was strong-arming the officer. There are some reports that say he was struggling to get away from the officer, and reports from eyewitnesses are contradictory as to what exactly happened between Michael Brown, who was 18 and unarmed, and the officer. Later, Sunday, August 10th, St. Louis County Police Chief Joe Belmar said in a news conference that Brown physically assaulted the officer during a struggle between the two. Brown reached for the officer's gun. One shot was fired in the car, followed by other gunshots outside of the car. News reports from local bystanders suggested that Brown responded to the officer pulling him into the car, struggled with the officer, and then tried to pull away and run away from the officer. A candlelight vigil to honor Brown later on Sunday, August 10th, turned violent. More than a dozen businesses were vandalized and looted. We're not sure exactly who was involved in those encounters, but more than 30 people were arrested, and 2 police officers suffered injuries, according to police. Monday, August 11th, hundreds gathered outside the Ferguson Police Department to demand justice for Brown's death. Police arrested at least 7 people. The FBI then announced that the agency would do a parallel investigation into the shooting of Michael Brown. On that same day, community members and leaders met and prayed at a meeting hosted by the NAACP. Several gathered again in Ferguson, and police reportedly used tear gas to disperse crowds that did not protest peacefully. On Tuesday, August 10th, the police announced 15 arrests stemming from Ferguson events Monday evening. In addition, St. Louis County Police Chief said the name of the officer involved in the shooting would not be released due to threats on social media. So up to this point, we didn't know which officer had been involved in the altercation. Protesters gathered at St. Louis County Police Department headquarters for a peaceful protest, where a list of demands was given relating to the investigation of Brown's death. Reverend Al Sharpton arrived in St. Louis that same day, Tuesday, August 12th, to speak to the family of Brown, and made his way around the St. Louis area to demand justice in the fatal shooting. Also, Tuesday, August 12th, President Obama released a statement regarding the Brown incident, and the Justice Department announced that it would take on reviewing police tactics across the country. Governor Jay Nixon, City of St. Louis mayor, and other area leaders came together to speak on the Brown case. At a separate public meeting, Reverend Al Sharpton and the Brown family urged a peaceful fight toward justice for Michael Brown. But tensions rose that night again. Wednesday, August 13th, after a third night of protests full of tension, the city of Ferguson asked protests and vigils for Michael Brown to be held during the daytime. The Justice Department opened a federal civil rights investigation related to the Ferguson shooting, and Ferguson police said at a news conference that the 911 tape from Saturday would be released soon. Wednesday, August 13th, police detained 2 reporters from the Huffington Post and another from the Washington Post. Police began to throw tear gas later that evening at protesters in Ferguson in order to disperse crowds. During the commotion, police also forced the media to move back out of the area and threw tear gas at an Al Jazeera America crew. This, again, is according to news reports. Thursday, August 14th, police announced that 16 people had been arrested and 2 officers injured during the 4th night of what they called violence. Missouri Governor Jay Nixon made his first stop of many through North St. Louis County and Ferguson. And Governor Jay Nixon announced Thursday that the Missouri Highway Patrol would take control of security in Ferguson and that the unit would be overseen by Captain Ron Johnson, who was born and raised near the community and was noted to be African American. Across the country, silent vigils were held to remember and honor the memory of Michael Brown, and citizens marched peacefully alongside state troopers, and no violent clashes were reported for the first time since the shooting. Friday, August 15th, Darren Wilson was named as the officer who shot Brown on August 9th. Wilson had been on the force for 6 years, had no disciplinary action against him, and Police Chief Thomas Jackson said he was an upstanding officer. The announcement came 3 days after police originally said they would name the officer, citing a fear for the officer's safety. The police chief also gave details about a strong-arm robbery that same day at a local convenience store that took place moments before Wilson shot Brown. He did not connect Brown to the robbery during his news conference, but in police documents he released to reporters, Brown is named as a suspect. Jackson released dispatch records and video surveillance of the robbery as well on Friday, August 15th. Highway Patrol Captain Ron Johnson said at a security briefing that he hoped peaceful protests would continue in Ferguson. He said that violence would not solve the issue, and Governor Jay Nixon reassured people that the investigation's focus remains on finding out how and why Brown was killed. The family of Michael Brown released a statement saying they are beyond outraged by how the information was released about Michael Brown being a suspect in the robbery, and felt that there was an assassination of the character of their son, tying him to the robbery. Chief Thomas Jackson said Darren Wilson, the officer who shot Brown, did not know Brown was a suspect in a strong-arm robbery that happened moments before the shooting. Wilson stopped Brown for walking in the middle of the street. Later that same evening, Reverend Jesse Jackson linked arms with protesters in Ferguson and led a group in prayer and urged them to turn pain into power while fighting back nonviolently. Saturday, August 16th, Governor Nixon issued a state of emergency for the Ferguson area and imposed a curfew until further notice. He said, reportedly, if we are going to achieve justice, we must first have and maintain peace. This is a test. The eyes of the world are watching. Sunday, August 17th, 7 people were arrested and 1 person shot as police and protesters clashed again in a haze of tear gas, despite a curfew that took effect at midnight. Citing the extraordinary nature of the case, Justice Department spokesman Brian Fallon said Attorney General Eric Holder has ordered a separate federal autopsy for Brown at the request of his family. The St. Louis County Medical Examiner's autopsy concluded that Brown died of gunshot wounds, but other details had not been released. Sunday, August 18th, a private autopsy requested by Brown's family found that he was shot at least 6 times, including 4 times in the right arm and twice in the head. The New York Times reported all of the shots were fired from Brown's front, a finding that could contradict a witness statement indicating that Brown was hit as he ran away from police. Monday, August 18th, Governor Nixon ordered the National Guard into Ferguson after protesters shot at police, threw Molotov cocktails at officers, looted local businesses, and carried out a coordinated attempt to block roads and overrun the police commander center, Nixon's office said in a statement. Michael Baden, the Brown family's hired pathologist who performed a private autopsy on Brown's body, said his results could be consistent with the police's or witnesses' account of how Brown died. From a scientific point of view, we can't determine which witness is most consistent, Baden said at a news conference. Governor Nixon lifted the curfew in Ferguson after it failed to thwart violence over those 2 nights that he had the National Guard in Ferguson. He said the National Guard would have limited responsibilities from that point to help keep order during late-night protests, along with the State Highway Patrol and local law enforcement. Monday, August 18th, President Obama announced he was dispatching Attorney General Eric Holder to monitor the unrest in Ferguson. Obama called on people to address the gulf that exists between minorities and law enforcement, but said we must do so with respect for all sides. Tuesday, August 19th, Captain Ron Johnson of the Missouri State Highway Patrol said that 31 people were arrested overnight. 4 police officers were injured by thrown rocks and bottles. At least 2 people were shot and 2 fires were set during a night of clashes between police and protesters. And Wednesday, August 20th, a grand jury began investigating whether Ferguson police officer Darren Wilson should be criminally charged for the death of Michael Brown. Thursday, August 21st, news reporters said Ferguson enjoyed its first night of relative calm since Brown was killed. August 9th, many of the 150 protesters who had paced back and forth Ferguson's West Florissant Avenue had gone home, tensions diffused by community leaders, a more relaxed posture by police, and the arrival of U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. Thursday, August 21st, Governor Jay Nixon ordered the Missouri National Guard to begin withdrawing from Ferguson. Since then, most of the reports have focused on the grand jury convening. And so here we are this evening to talk about how we got here, how we got to the death of Michael Brown by a police officer and the following events in Ferguson. And where are we now? And where do we go from here? So I opened the conversation directing the first of the opening remarks to Professor Chris Tinson, just to kind of give us a sense of historically, culturally, how do we begin to make sense of these events, contextualize them in our history, and respond to some of the discrepancies. Professor Tinson.
What's up, y'all? Y'all good? Y'all kind of quiet. We're not at a funeral yet. Exactly. Hands up. Hands up. Hands up. That's the rally cry, right? Y'all got to be louder than that. Hands up. There it is. So we have to create that energy to sustain ourselves. This is a dark time in many senses of that word and phrase. And it's hard to create a sense of hope when you are constantly reminded of the fragility of Black life and this lack of value in this society, especially when it comes to power. And so we don't want to just jump in and talk directly about the issue of race, because that's definitely there. But really, we could start off by thinking about how power is held and kept in this society. The way we think about Missouri is about this question of power. and St. Louis, these municipalities that make it very difficult for black people to express their humanity, express their citizenship, critical though it may be, is there for a reason. Is there to maintain a sense of power, the power to govern, the power to rule. And those that have it don't want to give it up. And this is how I start to think about, in the days since we've been waiting for some kind of action to be taken against Darren Wilson. Matter of fact, does anybody know where Darren Wilson is right now? Paid vacation? He's chilling. We worried. So this is the contradiction that we live in right now, is that the state is able to have a monopoly on this issue of power, and the citizens, us, have to just take it. And one of the things that I love about this moment in Ferguson, even though it's amid such tragedy, is this fact that people didn't want to take it anymore. They didn't want to go along with the setup. They didn't want to get in line. They didn't want to be quiet. They wanted to be heard. They wanted to be rowdy. They wanted to show the ugliness that they felt they lived under every single day. Are there any folks from St. Louis out here today? Because I don't want to, dirty up your town in front of you. We just met. So, are there any police officers in the building? All right. I didn't see no hands. Okay. Where? Okay, cool. Thanks for coming. Because this is a conversation that I personally have been waiting to have with police. And the reason why I say it in those direct terms is because we don't have time to play around anymore. We need to know who is there to defend black life and who is there to feel threatened by it, and who is there to be ready to extinguish it. Who is there to value it and protect it. This is how we think of Mike Brown. Think of one of our loved ones, people in this room, friends, family, cousins, comrades, however, who on their way home just lose their life, and how empty you would feel. And now think about that. If that happened every couple of years, people were being disappeared in different formats, it would be difficult to stomach. So where we are right now is exactly where we were in 2012 dealing with Trayvon Martin. And we should know that since that time, the Department of Justice has had over 17 police departments under federal investigation since 2012. There's 18,000 police departments in this country. Only 17 of them have gone under DOJ review. Now, some people could say, well, yeah, because the police are doing a great job by and large. And that may be true, but also true are the facts that lay before us. The facts of Mike Brown languishing on the concrete in front of all to see. And thankfully, social media and technology was put to good use, and the world found out about it within hours. And the reason why I've been waiting to have this conversation is because we haven't had many open dialogues in town halls where people really talk about how power is welded in this society, and who has a monopoly on violence in this society, and who gets considered a threat to society, and who feels that it's their rightful duty and purpose to govern others. And if we think about that, this case in this way, that puts into context the governor of Missouri, Jay Nixon, prosecutor Bob McCullough, and Jeff Roorda, who is the business manager of the St. Louis Police Officers Union. And there isn't many reports about this connection, but those are the folks who are mainly responsible for both the release of the officer's name at the same time that they released that video that we all saw. And that video did its job because it forced us to try Mike Brown all over again, because he had been tried once by bullets. And now he was going to get tried again in the court of public opinion. And this led many to not come to the rallies that ensued, stay at home, because they wanted to question Mike Brown's viability as a victim. Was he a good, upstanding victim? Was he a good dude? Or was he a thug? Because if he was a thug, we don't need to rally around him. If he's a good dude, we can stand up for that. Without thinking about the larger context, the social, political, economic context, the cultural context that produce the so-called thug, that image. And so being a person that's close to hip-hop culture, even though I'm old now, yes, that's a very common trope that's hurled at young black men in particular. So I don't have any formal remarks other than to say we have to really organize long term and figure out a way to build solidarity. That's one of the things I'm going to talk about today, is building solidarity locally, nationally, and also with other issues of hard-hit communities throughout the world, other communities that are hard hit by violence and militarization, right? And make those connections. But the point is that there's a small group of folk in and around St. Louis whose job it is to figure out how to maintain power and to keep black people largely disempowered. And so for us, how do we do what we can to help create empowering contexts for local communities besieged by violence, crime, police surveillance, and police abuse? How do we create empowerment? What role do the police play in our civic empowerment, rather than our civic insecurity? So I'll just start off like that. I can't leave on a happy. I can't start on a happy note. I'm sorry.
Thank
but
you.
The point is that that's where we're at right now.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yes. Professor Christina Greer, maybe you can give us some context for the political mobilization organization.
Sure. I wanted to thank you all for having me. I forgot to put this in my bio, I was a Mendenhall Fellow and a Mellon postdoc here from 2006 to 2009, so it's really nice to be back. I want to thank Alice Hurst and the Government Department for having me. I also want to say, tweet me questions if you all don't have paper to fill out, or if you're in the other room or in your houses. So tweet me the questions and hopefully we can get to them during Q&A as well. And going on something that Chris said, I'd always be curious to see if we asked or surveyed police departments what they thought their job and duty was, and if we actually surveyed communities and asked them what they thought the role of police officers were. Because I have a feeling we'd get very different responses and very different answers. And so we'll talk about that obviously with the increased militarization of not just communities, but to be more specific, communities of color. So I want to make 3 points regarding a more political science perspective, and then circle back to certain things that Riche said when you were crafting the format of this panel, which is incredibly important. So I wanted to talk, the first thing is about urban renewal and really thinking about how these folks got to Ferguson in the first place, right? Because this isn't a story about an inner city issue, right? This is actually a suburb. And so I think we need to remember that, you know, these suburbs are created due to the original issue of white flight and middle class flight from urban centers, right? When you had not only wealthy whites, but middle class blacks as well, leaving cities, right? And creating a real dearth of anything going on in urban centers. And then over time, the outer ring suburbs get larger and larger. And lately, for those of you who study urban politics, politics, we realize that whites, especially middle class and upper middle class whites, have wanted to reclaim cities yet again. And so that pushes, right? That pushes communities of color out, that pushes poor people out. And this is actually how we get Ferguson in the first place, right? These are people who are largely transient, non-homeowners, and they actually do not hold many elected offices, right? So this is the context of urban, and I'm putting renewal in quotes. The second thing I want to talk about is descriptive versus substantive representation. Do you guys know what that is? Right? So descriptive is actually electing someone who looks like you, right? We know it's at Smith College. We know there's an importance of, electing females to executive office, right, or upper level offices. But the substantive representation piece is key, right? So the famous example that I always use, if Clarence Thomas were an elected official, substantively, he does not necessarily represent the vast majority of the African American electorate. So the issue with Ferguson is that it lacks both descriptive and substantive representation, right? So we know that there's a dearth of elected officials of color in Ferguson and surrounding Ferguson, but we also know that there's a dearth of elected officials that actually have the interests of the individuals at Ferguson at heart. And so then this brings me to a point that I've been wanting to say to the Smith community for quite some time. If you look at the leadership in Ferguson, it's largely male. If you look at the leadership in St. Louis and sort of the surrounding areas. And so part of that issue is that qualified candidates don't run, and female qualified candidates especially don't run. And so I take this as an opportunity anytime I'm in front of a group of students is to implore you to run, right? I'm asking all of you this evening to think about running at some point in your life, whether it's school board president, whether it's state assembly, whether it's Congress, Senate, or the presidency, right? You all can never say that no one ever asked you to run because I'm asking you to run this evening. I'm serious. And so when we look at the leadership that's in Ferguson and surrounding Ferguson, whether appointed, elected, or self-selected, right? And we'll talk about that, I'm sure, because there are many self-selected leaders who popped up in Ferguson. They're all primarily male as well, right? And some have varying levels of qualification, which is somewhat problematic. Which leads me to my third point, which is the difference between protest politics and electoral politics, right? Many media outlets kept using the word riot. I refuse to use that word. I object that word completely. Riot implies people are just going hysterical for no reason, right? This is a rebellion. This is a deep-seated, rooted series of issues that have plagued a community, not just for the past few months, but we're talking decades, right? Decades of poverty, decades of lack of economic opportunities, decades of a lack of political opportunities, and there's a lack of power, as Chris stated. So that's where rebellions arise. They also arise when you don't have good leadership. So when electoral politics tends to fail communities, that's where you get protest politics, right? But the reward of protest politics is oftentimes an increase in electoral politics, right, and electoral representation. So it's this cyclic relationship that doesn't always yield the fruit that we'd hope it would. Going back to something that Rashay said, though, about this concept of rebellion with the media reporting about Molotov cocktails and individuals shooting at police, which were never substantiated. It reminds me of the Kent State accounts. When they said students threw rocks at police officers, which warranted police officers then attacking students. But when you look at the footage, there are no rocks on campus, right? So when you go back and look at Ferguson, where are these supposed Molotov cocktails, right? Who was shot? So if police officers were shot, where, right? Where are the casings? So this is just wanting, imploring you all to ask more questions when the media reports it, right? I mean, we know that Black Twitter has essentially been on the case, but, it's true, right? But we can't take CNN or even MSNBC, right? I'm leaving Fox out of this conversation for right now. But I mean, you know, they also serve a role, but, you know, even the sort of the people who are on the side of the diversity super friends, we can't also neglect to ask them serious questions as well, because they oftentimes use the word riot. They oftentimes put Mike Brown in the same trial that Chris alluded to. Later on, we can discuss, as someone who teaches presidency, we can discuss the role of Obama. Obama as a black president, or Obama as a president who happens to be black. And I didn't vote for Eric Holder, so there are certain things that I expect of elected officials. So we can talk about that. So there are a few facts that I also just want to close with so I don't talk too much. There's never been a history of blacks terrorizing whites in this country. And so this fear of blacks rising up when these quote unquote riots happen are essentially irrational fears, right? There's never been a history of black communities lynching white people. There's never been a history of, right? There's never been a history of black police officers tear gassing white women and children, or using dogs on them, or fire hoses, right? So this irrational fear of this black nation coming to get white communities, it has never existed in the history of this American democratic project, which is still in question. It is, and I think we should question it, right? I mean, the Federalist Papers and the Constitution are two of the most beautiful documents you'll ever read, but that doesn't mean that they have come to fruition as of yet. But that also doesn't mean that we should stop trying. Going off of Chris's point really quickly, I just want to sort of begin to close with this concept of dignity for black youth and black men. And so, you know, it started with Trayvon Martin and the hoodie conversation, right? If he weren't wearing a hoodie, then maybe he wouldn't have been shot. Mark Zuckerberg wears a hoodie. No one's ever complained about that, right? And that's, I mean, these are the ways that we should think about these things. And it led me to think about, if we were to talk about some of the white students who've been killed in school shootings, if we were to talk about them the same way we talked about Mike Brown, it would be wholly unacceptable to say that a child was shot in the middle of the day for no reason and say, well, they skipped school. They were bullied. They cheated on a test. We would never have a character assassination of a child like that. And why should we do that with Mike Brown? Lastly, this can't just be a conversation amongst people who care and are affected, right? I worry every time black men that I know and love walk down the street in the middle of the day, right? But it can't just be a conversation between people who are involved. It has to extend to police officers. It has to extend to communities that ostensibly have no pony in the race, right? But we all do if this democratic experiment is to work. So I'll pause right there and leave it to you. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. This thing on? Okay, all right. So serious. It's wonderful to be here amongst, I see many friends, and to be with a community with which I've had an involvement recently over the past few years or so. What's not mentioned in my biography that Professor Barnes read is also that I'm a faculty affiliate here in African American Studies. So I think I see some of my colleagues from African American Studies here, and I'd like to give them a shout out as well. So thank you so much for coming. And of course, you being one of them. As a historian and someone who studies this thing and these types of things in historical context, I'm always torn in terms of how I frame an analysis. When you study decades and sometimes centuries, there's always that temptation to say that there's nothing new under the sun. And in fact, I want to be clear that police brutality is in no way new at all. There have been complaints from black communities, Latino communities, Chinese communities in various parts of the country, various parts of U.S. history about the way they have been treated by police. And I think it doesn't serve us very well to think about this as an isolated case, or as cops run amok, or as a matter of simple poor training. Clearly, all of those have come into play. But we also have to, think about what is the role of police. We have to think this in very fine tune. I don't want to, I don't want to, scare you too much, but I'd be remiss as an educator if I let you all walk out of this room thinking, oh yes, the police are, otherwise, things go really well until you get a couple of rogue cops. Well, this is a pervasive problem in police departments all over the country, and this is a situation with which we've lived for decades now. That said, there are some things that are new about this. We're in a moment of time. That's redundant, a moment of time, but okay, you have it, there it is. A moment where we're seeing something different in police forces. I mean, police abuse has always been there, but it's at a level now where on an ideological and a political and also in a funding way, in a kind of monetary way, it's evolved to something quite different from what it would have been even 50 years ago. And that's to say the paramilitarization of police forces. That's something that's a bit new, at least in the sense, in historical terms, when a historian tells you something is new, it basically means it's about 50 years or less, so I should be clear about that. Since we had the Omnibus Crime Bill of 1968, for example, and when Lyndon Johnson launched a war on crime, we started to see these gradual but perceptible shifts in how we've governed ourselves, and some sociologists have even called it governing through crime. That now citizenship, as opposed to maybe the early 20th century from the 1930s on, where you might have said, I'm a citizen because I'm a working American, I want to belong to a union, and everyone should have a fair shake, a fair deal, as Truman called it. Increasingly since 1960, and particularly since the 1980s, we see people making claims on the state based on victim status. And it's never before this period did we have, for example, such weight given to people who are not just victims of crime, but also portraying themselves or seen by popular media or popular opinion as potential victims of crime. And this is where we get the criminalization of black people just generally across a spectrum, that they are always to be this potential criminal, this thing that's about to happen, this crime that's about to happen. And so the police force's idea since then has been that we're here to prevent crime, and basically that means rounding up as many black people as possible. Those are the origins of stop and frisk policy and broken windows. The idea that you can prevent crime just by kind of just really harassing people all day long. That's different. Militarization in police forces has emerged also not just in terms of the political rhetoric, but also in how we fund police forces. If you all probably, I imagine, unless you just weren't watching images at all, it just went text-based, but I mean, you saw the equipment that the police officers in Ferguson were carrying. This is a small community of I don't know how many tens of thousands of people which had MRAPs, I forget what MRAP stands for, but anti-IED carriers, all types of heavy armaments, full body suits, etc. That's not unusual. There are about 17,000 communities across the country that have gotten federal funding, to say nothing of state funding, for military-grade weaponry and assault material. This is everything from bulletproof vests up to the Bearcats, the big armor carriers, AR assault rifles, M16s, M14s, flash grenades, et cetera, really bad stuff. Things that should not be used on a domestic population, by the way. It's wartime stuff. It's not even useful in these situations. I mean, some of the armaments that you carry, if you pull the trigger, you can get an entire crowd. This is not for domestic, let's say this were a riot, which I agree with Professor Greer, it was not at all. It was actually a very peaceful protest. Even still, you would never want to use this stuff in a domestic setting. This is all because we've funded hundreds of millions of dollars to police forces to allow them to purchase this type of equipment. This is through Program 1033, which is through the Department of Defense, which gives tens of millions of dollars every year of supposedly used equipment, but quite often it's brand new. So every time, this is something else to think about, every time we get into a military conflagration across the seas, which seems to be our natural state at this point. No, seriously, I mean, have we ever been at peace? I mean, even in the 80s, those are all those dirty wars, Gulf War I, early 90s. We've been at constant war for decades now. But something else that happens is that all this stuff washes ashore. As soon as the military leaves, whatever they take with them can get sold back to police forces or just given away, really. So at this point, we get half $500 million have been given just under Project 1033 to police forces. $500 million, $500 million in arms, not in assistance, not in training, just in guns. And when all you have is a hammer, everything seems to look like a nail. Or if all you have is a gun, you typically are going to pull the trigger. This is not, and I also want to, when I say there's nothing new under the sun, I also want to inject some more caution there as well, because there's a certain interconnectedness of all of these events that we really should not take our eye off of at all. This is much bigger contextually, certainly than just Ferguson, certainly than just police abuse. And it goes fundamentally to what Professors Greer and Tinson have described as issues of power and how race has insinuated itself into, not insinuated, it's race is at the kind of fundamental premises of how power is distributed here. This is not unconnected from the various domestic wars we've fought, which is to say the war on crime after 1968. Anyone want to guess what the next one was? War on drugs, 1971. Then renewed, part 2, under Reagan in the 1980s. Then war on terror, of course. And all the kind of little things in between that we've basically turned, and to say nothing about mass incarceration has been a product of all of this as well. So that we've turned quite a good many of our citizenry into potential criminals, meaning not that I think they have the potential to commit crime, but meaning that's the way they are seen in public policy, in the law. The judiciary and the legislature have done nothing to stem this whatsoever. So I'm kind of very, I'm kind of at a loss for words to figure out what are their next moves there. Executive branches, pretty much quite often, as Professor Tinson mentioned, will find themselves held hostage to police benevolent associations, which is the police officers' unions. So I'm not sure, what branch of our government we can expect to see the most movement on this. I also want to say too, and I have other comments which I'll leave for later, but another connection that we cannot, that we have to pay attention to is not just the prison industrial complex, but the prison debt industrial complex as well. And even while we have an attack on mass incarceration, I think we basically peaked at mass incarceration about 3 or 4 years ago. It seems to be going down, particularly in the state of New York where I live. We've drastically reduced our prisoner population. But that does not mean that we end a system of severe imbalance in power vis-a-vis a criminal justice system. And what I say by that is that we still have a lot of people walking wounded, so to speak, meaning that once they're released, they're still carrying this record, and they're difficult for them to find employment, difficult for them to get educational opportunity, even housing opportunities. And furthermore, for many people who are kind of rotating in and out of the criminal justice system, because most people in prisons are actually there for usually fairly short times in the grand scheme of American incarceration. Short time is 5 to 10 years when you have juries routinely giving out 5 life sentences at a time. But people who go in and out then become more and more in debt, quite often in debt to the criminal justice system itself. In Ferguson, for example, what has been the state of affairs that has been regnant there for a number of years is that people are routinely locked up overnight or longer in the county jail for unpaid parking tickets. And I don't mean hours, I mean nights there. Enough time to lose the good job that you barely got in the first place. Enough time to really worry your family. Enough time to really just basically screw up the rest of your year or more. And this was a pervasive practice, as it is in many police jurisdictions. Civil forfeiture is the way many police departments, particularly in the South, actually make the ends meet, so to speak. It is a revenue stream. So we cannot take our eyes off of that either. Really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you so much for coming.
Good afternoon. I'm not really pleased about the occasion for this panel, but I have to say that I'm really happy to be a part of this important event here at Smith, and thank my fellow panelists for all the great comments we've gotten so far. I mean, as we know, as we can see, this is an enormously complicated issue, or interlocking sets of issues when we talk about Ferguson and the killing of Michael Brown. The other thing, of course, is, and this says something about this case and what's happening, is we don't know, as Professor Barnes was saying, we don't really, if you boil down what she was saying, we don't know a hell of a lot of things about this case for sure. There's been a lot of hiding, a lot of obfuscation. So I think, though, having said that, I simply want to ask a few questions here that, I'm hoping to say something about, and perhaps will answer, piggybacking off of some that are related to some of the things that my fellow panelists have already talked about. I guess I'm here as the culture person, so one of the things I think about is culture, cultural images, cultural iconography, and so on, and its relationship to politics and power here. So one question that I would pose, and I think it's enormously important, is how is it possible, or how does it happen that a young man like Michael Brown, who we don't know tremendous amounts about, but what we do know about him is he was a young man with no adult criminal record, no serious juvenile criminal record, maybe no juvenile criminal record at all. We're not absolutely sure about that, with a known history of being adverse to physical conflict. In other words, despite being a big guy, there was an interesting, although somewhat dubiously framed, profile in the New York Times where apparently he liked to avoid conflict. He used his size to avoid conflict. How could it be plausible? How could it be the Ferguson Police Department and the St. Louis County law enforcement make us believe that it is plausible? How could many people find it plausible? Chris Tinson was talking about being tried. Again, that such a young man could be so crazed as to attack an armed police officer, flee the police officer, and then charge that police officer again, necessitating the police officer. Apparently, I think at that point, it seems likely that that's when he was shot in the head and killed. How could we find this believable? Why would people find this believable? What is the relationship to power? How could he be that insane, whether crazed by drugs? The report released, one of the very few things that has been released besides the video, the security camera recording of the convenience store, was the toxology report that apparently he had, allegedly had a marijuana in his blood, that he was so crazed by drugs, or as Bill O'Reilly suggested, rap music, or his own animalistic nature to engage in such insane behavior, necessitating, making it necessary for Darren Wilson to shoot him several times, including twice in the head, maybe at least once when his head was down. And so how does this become plausible? What relationship does this have to power? And that, as one might say, how does this keep on happening? As my fellow panelists have pointed out, this is not the first time such a thing has happened. What has made this unique, or not unique, but unusual, is that the community response to this killing, the overwhelming community response, not simply of what we might call the usual political activists, but also what people we might think of as everyday people. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. So we want to make sure that we continue to, or start to, engage a conversation about these really important issues. The panelists have raised quite a few issues that we want to have an opportunity to talk amongst the panel, and also make sure that we reserve some bit of time for questions from the audience, although of course we won't be able to get to everyone, and I do apologize for that in advance. So there are a few themes that have come up throughout your opening remarks, and one of the things that I kept kind of coming back to in your opening remarks, and something that we've talked about even before we got together here today, is this question of citizenship and belonging. And I think even in each of your opening remarks, there's some bit of a response to that question of how do we get to a situation where Michael Brown, who's walking down the street and at the time has not been accused of having committed a crime, is not a suspect in any sort of criminal offense, is then stopped by police for walking apparently in the middle of a street where there was no traffic. And it brings me to the question, and it's one that I borrow a bit of the framing from Jennifer Walters, it brings me to a question of citizenship and belonging, and one that African Americans in particular have had to come back to over and over again, this proof of American citizenship. And whoever would like to respond first, and then we'll just continue the conversation.
I'll start really briefly. What frustrates me about this concept of black citizenship and belonging, seems like blacks are only allowed to belong when we have this politics of respectability. Something that I think the Obamas have done Black America a great disservice. In many ways, when they talk about blacks, it is under this politics of respectability. If you would only pull your pants up, you wouldn't get pulled over by the cops, right? If you would only, not have a hip hop swagger or whatever that may be, then some of these things wouldn't happen. Police officers shooting unarmed black children in the middle of the day is not going to happen miraculously overnight. So I think tackling this concept of black respectability vis-a-vis citizenship is a start. And I want to go back to something that Jim said, in thinking about Mike Brown and as a citizen, right? And many people really do tout the fact that he didn't have a record, right? What if he did have a record? Does that mean he should get shot in the middle of the day and lay there like a dog for 6 hours? No, right? What if he did smoke weed, right? Yes, we have the president of Smith here, so I'm not going to ask all of you all how many of you have smoked marijuana, right? Or done ecstasy. These are serious questions, right? No, he didn't have a record. How many of you have shoplifted, right? How many of you have done illegal drugs, had, underage drinking? These are all real things that 18-year-olds get into, right? And so I think when we frame the death of Mike Brown, or the murder of Mike Brown, the murder of Trayvon Martin, the murder of Eric Garner, selling illegal cigarettes, right? These are things where it's like, well, as a citizen, he's allowed to have a record. He's allowed to not be perfect, right? As the New York Times says, he was no angel. Give me a list of the angels, then. Provide a list.
I definitely have shoplifted, but I'm not going to tell you what else I did. Okay. So the issue around citizenship is important because he's chopped down before he's able to fully express his citizenship. And, we talk about electoral politics, which is certainly a part of this puzzle and also a part of the solution. But what empowerment beyond the electoral process do we see in Ferguson, you know, for African Americans, for people who are working class standing? So for me, the issue of citizenship for particularly young black people is always contested, it's always suspect, and it's always needing to be proved or needing to be shown. So there's a performance that goes along with citizenship. We have to look a certain way in order to be treated a certain way. That's the respectability politics that she's mentioning. So the point is that when we repudiate that, where does that leave us? But when we conform to it, where does that leave us? Because one of the things that is worrisome about people reading our bios and talking about what we've accomplished is that outside of these educational spaces, we largely are irrelevant to the society. We don't get respected. They don't say Dr. Tinson. But the point is that we make, and we should take advantage of these opportunities and speak truth to power while we're here. But the reality is there's another reality outside of these educational spaces that are largely safe. They have their own microaggressions. But the point is that we're one step away, we're one police officer away from a situation like a Mike Brown, even as so-called respectable as we seem to be as professors. And so the point is that I go back to an earlier question that I raised. What's the value of black life in this society? And does the society feel that it can do away with black life, or does this society think that it can deal with black life on its own terms? The last thing I will say is I'm emboldened and fascinated by the work that the Dream Defenders have been doing. Y'all know about the Dream Defenders? I'm also fascinated and intrigued by the work and proud of the work that the Organization for Black Struggle has been doing for over 40 years in St. Louis. Anybody know that organization? Exactly. But I also want you to refer to a study that was done in 2013 by the Malcolm X grassroots movement that had a chilling statistic, which was simply that every 28 hours, a black person is killed by police or self-deputized persons in this country. Every 28 hours. You can look that study up. It's called Operation Ghetto Storm. Sounds like a Public Enemy record. But point is that they did the work of showing. And in the calendar year, they showed that over 300 people had been killed extrajudicially. You know, over 300. It wasn't just Trayvon Martin. It wasn't just Oscar Grant, who we already forgot about. And he wouldn't have been known to a certain segment of our society had not a movie been made, Fruitvale Station. So the point is that how do we remember these tragedies, and how we forget them, to me, determines how we see the citizenship of African Americans, people of African descent, working class people in this country.
Before we hear additional comments on this question, I just want to just stick in a little caveat, and that is to say, I don't know how many of you know about the politics of respectability and where that comes from, but some of my research is involved in kind of investigating how that becomes operable today. It's a early 20th century response that actually came out of the black community, and it was in response to these attacks and lynchings that were happening right at the turn of the century following slavery and the Reconstruction era. And it was developed by African Americans, primarily African American women, who were trying to find ways to arm themselves, protect themselves and their loved ones. And it basically said, if we can look the part, act the part, we may be accepted, and we can cut down on the violence against us. So it came out of the Black community, and it was in response to similar circumstances to what we're seeing today. And so a lot of what we hear people talking about with the politics of respectability, particularly Black people, Black leaders, saying, you know, we need to carry ourselves a certain way and do certain things. I don't suggest that this is the way we should progress today. We should be beyond this. But we need to remember that this was a way that people felt that they could protect their individual selves and their loved ones and the greater community, right? We need new tactics. I think the things that that Chris Tinson talked about just a few minutes ago, the organizations that are being used to mobilize, this is the way that we should be moving forward. It should not be this individual-based politics of respectability. But for many people, and in the research that I've done with Black women who are scared to death for their children, that's what they're teaching their children. You know, be careful how you present yourself. Not great, but in many instances, all that we have.
Thank you. To the question about citizenship, I just wanted to raise another, never a good idea when you're on a panel, just answer a question with another one. But I'd like to question what we think citizenship actually means. It's one of these kind of ideologically freighted, you know, oh, America the beautiful kind of words that, you know, you can just say citizenship and then we all think we know what that means, but there's actually many kinds of citizenships, and if you start to interrogate all of them, you realize that it's certainly not enjoyed by a large, I would say majority of individuals in the United States. If you think about economic citizenship, the idea that, you know, a certain standard of living should be ensured for all just as a basis of belonging to a citizenry. Clearly we don't have that. One might argue, including this one right here, that we've never had that. Electoral citizenship. We're asking people for IDs in several districts throughout the South, the Midwest. I mean, I guess any place south of Canada, as Malcolm X said, you're in the South. We are having that problem. Electoral citizenship has been truncated for many, many years. It did not end with the Voting Rights Act of '65, or lack of electoral citizenship did not end there. Sexual citizenship, making some strides, but clearly we have a ways to go on that. And not just about identity politics and citizenship, but also reproductive rights. And that's not just the right to terminate a pregnancy, but also what rights do we have towards mothers to make sure that, and well, parents, to make sure that their children's welfare is ensured. And that definitely ties into the Brown case, right? Because there's, I mean, is there sympathy for Black mothers in this, right? I mean, is there any, I mean, as Professor Greer said, there's no one, you've never seen a Black police force gunning down white children like this. I mean, the kind of the outrage of white motherhood would just be upon us. And I mean the ideology, I don't mean like every white mother would be, right? But the way that ideology is mobilized is what I'm saying. And certainly jurisprudential citizenship, I don't think we've really attained that, and I think this case shows it as well. The politics of respectability was deeply problematic about that as well, is that for all of its origins in Black leadership, we also have to keep in mind that it was also a very classed and gendered way of doing politics as well. And a lot of that would blow back on Black ordinary people. So you have many a middle-class Black reformer, and middle class in the early 20th century basically means if you have any level of education and a job. It's not like a strict income thing. Many of our middle-class reformers from the early 20th century came from very humble beginnings. This politics of respectability blew back on ordinary Black citizens or non-citizens even back then. There were many a working-class Black person who responded to the politics of respectability, you know, more or less with the phrase, "You have to be kidding me! Like this is not workable at all." And I think 100 years later, we're seeing the same thing.
Can I just throw in something really quickly before we move on? Kim Crenshaw said something in response to Obama's "My Brother's Keeper," and she closed her New York Times op-ed by saying, "Why do we keep blaming the canary and not the mine?" And so I think that this is really important to think about in the context of citizenship when it comes to black males, especially, and black youth in general.
Yeah, I did want to say something. You know, I think citizenship is actually the key to this question, has always been the key for this question, at least since Reconstruction, a long time ago, which is to say is, what is citizenship? Well, you could say, as has been said here, there's a lot of things you can say about citizenship, but, you know, maybe one definition is it's an ability to exercise some degree of power, have some actual say within a certain sort of society, at least in terms of the United States, perhaps, to be, as we heard, substantively represented, you know, to actually substantively represent oneself. And I think that what we're talking about here really is a crisis of citizenship, which has its roots a long time ago with the failure in the end of Reconstruction. Because you all know what Reconstruction was. You know, whatever one can say about it in the late 1860s, 1870s, I don't want to get too professorial on you, but that it basically, you can say a lot of things about it, but it was a time when the idea was that race does not determine the quality of your citizenship. And that it was broken. It was destroyed by the people who bring segregation in which race had everything to do with the quality of your citizenship, the status of your citizenship. And how was it broken? I mean, somebody had to be voting for those radical Republicans. Someone had to be electing those black political leaders to office. You know, so you had to do two things. You had to eliminate or limit the black franchise, and you had to split white people, white voters off from Reconstruction. That was the only way it was going to work. How do you do that? Well, they did a lot of things. They did it through terror. They did it through legal and extra-legal means, the white supremacists, the segregationists, but also through this, again, the image of what we might think of as the original gangster or thug, the black man as sexually rapacious, habitually violent, shiftless, drinking, gambling, razor-toting, you know, these things that we can think of as analogs to this very day. In other words, people who are not only not fit to be citizens, but were actually a threat to the polity, to society, menaces to society. And this was part of, you know, culturally, putting black men in this way. There were also other versions for women, having more to do with morality, family values, and so forth, sexuality. That partly is how Reconstruction was broken, and it was a gift that kept on giving. It maintained segregation into the 1960s, and I would argue was repurposed in 1968 by actually the people who had opposed, at least in the South, the segregationists are conflicted with the people who'd used it before in Nixon and Agnew in the 1968 presidential campaign with their call for law and order in their so-called Southern strategy, which was not just aimed at the South or aimed at the South that's below the Canadian border, that again, we saw the repurposing of this notion of the monstrous, the savage black man. And that whether we talk about the Willie Horton, and you know, it continues to this very day, and culturally it's more prevalent than it ever was, thanks to the internet, thanks to Fox Television, thanks to radio shows. There's a whole right-wing sort of media that promotes this thing, and that, you know, is one way, you know, if we're thinking about the death of Eric Garner, if we're thinking of the death of Michael Brown, if we're thinking of the death of Trayvon Martin, is that it's precisely because that this has a political use. It is, in fact, this image, this type is related to power, that if we're talking about, combating it, we're talking about getting through it. It's not simply a question of overcoming some atavistic, archaic, old-fashioned prejudices that people have, but something that is promoted and produced right now for a political purpose. And again, I was saying that, asking those questions about Michael Brown before, because, again, thinking about the politics of respectability, it's a politics of a certain kind of representation, a certain kind of cultural representation, and what happens is that it does not matter, or it often does not matter how you represent yourself, as long as that these cultural types are out there, because that's not how you're not going to be necessarily read the way you're trying to represent yourself. And all you have to do is go onto the internet, into the right-wing blogosphere, and find about 20 gazillion, I mean, it's so disgusting. Actually, I have one or two of them on my laptop, but I don't know if I need to really show them. You can find them. You've probably seen them, representing President Obama, other words, as in many respects, as you think about his dossier, his CV, his resume, as respectable as they come, representing him in various ways as a thug, as a gangster, as being, and then in much the same way that, and sometimes side by side with Trayvon Martin or with Michael Brown. And I think that if we don't think about politics in this way, that this is a politics, that these images exist for political reasons and political purposes now, we're not going to get, really to how, and then which influences the vision of people like Darren Wilson. Why does he see him as a threat? Possibly. I mean, we don't know what Darren Wilson thought, but let's argue. Why does he really see Michael Brown as a threat, if he really does? Could it be that this vision is one that's got a hold on him, that's been produced for a certain political purpose? Anyway, and this has to do, I think, is a question of, from the very beginning was, who is a citizen, who is not a citizen, that was developed specifically to destroy black citizenship.
Thank you. Thank you. I think all of your comments so far have pointed us towards a conversation that's getting us more towards what do we do from here, and how do we start to think about moving forward in our communities right here in the Pioneer Valley, and also, what sorts of things can we suggest for communities outside of our own. So I'm starting to take questions from the audience and just trying to mobilize them, move them into the conversation as we continue. One of the questions that ties very nicely into a question that I had for the panel is about how protesters responded to the events in Ferguson. Many of the protests have been nonviolent. There have been some reports of violence, but the primary protest was nonviolent. And the primary way in which the discord was presented in Ferguson and to the nation was very peaceful. And so one of our audience members has asked, what about nonviolent action urged by black leaders? Is this the right move?
I can start. It depends on the circumstance. And I think that I'm not here to promote violence, but I'm also just, the idea of going in just saying this is our strategy and our philosophy is bound up in what we think is winnable by that strategy. So it's not just a basic philosophy that everybody holds to. We can gain some traction, we can gain some ground, we can draw in people who are less affected by this crisis if we operate in this kind of perspective. And I applaud that, and it's worked in different degrees. But let's not get it twisted. Nonviolence does not necessarily mean that it's not militant, right? So if all of us in this room walked out on Main Street up there and decided to lock arms, traffic is not going to move. Now that's nonviolent, but it's direct action. Some people call that militant. So I'm not opposed to militancy, but I am also, I think we should think about the monopoly on violence that the state has. And the fact that you don't have black police officers, you know, seeing all black youth as criminals, or people who can be shot, or people who can be tased to death, or people who need to be manhandled at all times. That should tell you the condition that, you know, this fact that the state has a one-directional view that is targeted at a particular kind of entity, a particular kind of public entity, that is this black body, this black being. And so I'm all for the efforts to bring redress, however that happens. Much of the folk that I'm connected to, Organization of Black Struggle, they are also a militant, nonviolent, direct action group. But there's never one strategy absence of other strategies. So that might be one tool. The next tool might be, how do you create some accountability? One of the things that people are calling for now is civilian review boards of the police. You know, there's only about 200 that are functioning, according to one study, 200 civilian review boards throughout the country that are functioning, that are thriving, that are truly independent of the police, of the governor's office, that are truly made up of citizens. So that's one apparatus. And so for me, that's important to think about in the context of whether or not there's militancy, nonviolence, or whatnot. But the things that Professor Roberts laid out in terms of the military technology, there is no way that you could just, you know, even if you wanted to have a guerrilla warfare situation, there's no way that you're going to have the technology to match what the United States government has. So that's not a winnable strategy. Unless you're trying to, you know, annihilate yourself. And most of the people I know are trying to live. But we also don't want to live under oppression, state oppression and repression. So those voices have to get out. So I'm not about, you know, containing the voices or containing the protests. But the point is we get caught up in what looks like violence and who's using violence and who's speaking in violent terms, rather than the conditions that that violence is meant to address, if it is coming from the people without power. So I just want to put that frame on it as well.
Great, thank you. Yes. Before we move to another response, another related question from the audience from our own Kim Dion in the government department here. Given the research by Christian Davenport and colleagues showing protests largely populated by African Americans are more likely to be responded to by police, and for those responses to more likely involve violence, how can African Americans safely exercise their right to assemble and voice their concerns? Is this an opportunity for white Americans to act as allies in agitating for social equality by protesting in solidarity?
I'm just going to try and morph the two questions. Because the history of African Americans in this country is the history of violence. But it's not the way we think, right? It's the history of violence being done to African Americans. But we still have this irrational white fear that blacks will be violent. But time and time again, we've seen systematic, decades worth of violence done, centuries worth of violence done to black bodies and black communities with no real, besides Nat Turner, right? But with no real systemic approach to that. As far as allies are concerned, and I'm just fascinated why black Americans are always expected to be nonviolent and peaceful with this history that we know, right? why is that always the expectation or the anticipation, or if anything is to happen or to change, then that's the expectation of the group. When it comes to allies, I think this is a really hard conversation, right, and something to really think through, because oftentimes allies have great hearts, but fail to recognize their own privilege, class and race and gender, and geographic locale. And so when you want to be with a group, you can't make assumptions, A, about the group. You can't want to lead the group in the direction that you think is best. And you also have to understand the complex histories of the group that you are not a part of and ultimately never will be. And so I think that's the sticky point with allies. They're definitely needed, right? We have to have these conversations. We see this in educational facilities all the time. It can't just be the diversity super friends who care about this, right? It has to be everybody else. Most of the time when we have these incidents, I know you all have blackface incidents and ghetto parties and all these things that happen every single year at every single institution, right? And then the people who get riled up are the people who are directly affected, not necessarily the people who are doing it, right? Or the people who should be in that room to actually have that conversation with. But it's a series of multiple steps to actually get the outsiders into the room. And by outsiders, I mean the people who don't perceive themselves to be necessarily directly affected by the incident, right? And oftentimes, those are the people who are, in a power context, the ultimate insiders.
Thank you. Any other panelists want to respond to both or either of those questions? Okay.
I'd say, just as a sort of historical thing, I mean, even though I'm the cultural person, just, you know, one thing it's worth remembering in terms of the question of nonviolence and the question of tactics and so forth. And, you know, like Chris Tinson, I don't recommend self-annihilation, but at this, one thing is, you know, the civil rights movement is often held up as this great triumph of nonviolence. And, you know, in some respects it was, but one of the reasons why, despite facing great violence at times, the civil rights movement was successful. One thing that helped protect the civil rights movement from even greater violence, from even more insane violence, from more murders and more, is that in addition to those people like Robert F. Williams and the Deacons for Defense, who were quite out front about armed self-defense, the racist, vigilante, violent Klan types knew, especially in the rural South, that black people, like white people, often like to hunt. They had guns. They knew that there was only so far that they could push. So one thing protecting Dr. King, one thing protecting SNCC, and besides the Deacons and sort of more organized forms of violence, is that they knew that there was only so far that they could push people, and then people would push back, as Malcolm X said, by any means necessary. So I think that, you know, while I wouldn't recommend going up against a tank with a handgun, it's important historically to represent that even in those moments which are taken to be the sort of epitome of nonviolent action in the United States, a willingness to go beyond nonviolence if necessary was part of what actually made nonviolence succeed. I think that's just a matter of historical record.
I was gonna, oh, thank you, sorry, I'll cut right in, sorry. Sorry. But actually, I do want to ask, so what is a nonviolent protest? Because that's just, what is our definition? I mean, because what I think I saw in Ferguson, maybe there were a few people throwing some rocks. I think there's a report of someone throwing a water bottle. Supposedly someone was shooting, but as Professor Greer says, it was like a grassy knoll kind of thing. We have no bullet casing. Grassy knoll was like JFK, kind of like a kind of mystery bullet. You guys are, all right, younger crowd here. But yeah, so I mean, that's one of those things. It's like we say, oh, Mike Brown was no angel. Like, oh, it was a good protest, maybe not entirely nonviolent. What is a nonviolent protest? I mean, it's kind of this ideological kind of politics or respectability thing. Oh, make sure you're nonviolent. Well, who organizes a violent protest? I mean, nobody does that as far as I know. But we do have decades of police organizations organizing themselves around violence and preparedness for it. I mean, heavy armament. You know, knowing that unless you're on, even if you are on camera committing an execution, you will, you might get like an administrative leave. But clearly that has been organized. But I mean, I don't understand what a nonviolent protest is, to be quite honest with you. And I'm not being flippant, but I also want to push back on some of these things, because these are dangerous words. You know, you put yourself on the defensive and say, oh, we're going to organize a nonviolent protest. Well, it's like, well, of course you are. I mean, unless you're forming a militia, of course. So, yeah.
Well, I would imagine that when people are asking about nonviolent action, particularly this question where the person is asking about nonviolent action urged by Black leaders, that they're pointing more towards kind of maybe a civil rights era question of community organizing. That means we're going to take it if we receive violence, right? We're not going to act in response to. So I think in this context, a nonviolent action would be we're purposefully going to resist responding, even if we are attacked. I think that's where it's coming from, this kind of this civil rights era question, and whether or not we are at a point when we need to stop thinking about it in that way, right? That we shouldn't respond. Are we past the civil rights era in a sense that when attacks come at us, we now need to respond?
Well, the thing we forget about the nonviolence as a tactic is that part of it was ideological, looking at Gandhi's tactics as well and his philosophy. But also it was backed by a tactics of make sure you have enough people to fill up the jails and overflow the jails, and then make sure you have enough lawyers on staff to get them all out. So it's not about just doing it for nonviolence sake. It's a way of jamming up the system, a coordinated assault on a system.
Right.
So that has to come into consideration as well. If you're dealing with a police force that is, taking nothing away from Bull Connor, Bull Connor was a really terrible police chief in Alabama. He's terrible, but like the police forces we have now are, much, bigger and badder than what was going on there. And again, taking nothing away from, not to insult his pride and his being a real jerk, but you have to make sure that works. If you're going to do a nonviolent protest where you fill up the jails, make sure the jails don't go on for days and days and days,
right, like
we've built them up to be over the past 40 years. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Excellent point.
Yep. I want to just speak real quick to this issue of the leadership. I think the folks in Ferguson they're looking for new leadership, in fact. I saw footage of, Jesse Jackson basically getting run out of town.
Yeah.
And so people from that era and that style, it seemed to not really create the sense of calm and purpose that many of the folks who were organizing peacefully were looking for. They didn't need that kind of leadership that we've been accustomed to. And I think that that's important, especially when we start talking about how we achieve some sense of accountability from Ferguson and what does accountability look like. But we've almost skipped over accountability and started talking about healing, right, as if you can get healing without some accountability. Right. And I think that this is where we need to really be strong-minded and long-winded in terms of pushing for accountability and using the mechanisms at our disposal to make sure that that is what we're after, and not just an easy sense of feel-good healing, a couple of sermons, and then we all go back home. And so for me, that's what many people like the OBS, Organization for Black Struggle, are calling for in St. Louis, and they have people on the ground and around the country who are demanding accountability.
Well,
and for everyone, I will call you Dr. Tinson.
Hey.
But I think more specifically with accountability before healing begins is justice. And this country does not have a solid history of providing justice for poor people or for communities of color. And when it comes to Ferguson, what they need is justice, what they have not received. And it doesn't look like they're going to receive it anytime soon, is justice. And so then the question, I think, initially was moving forward, right? So we know that we live in a society where nude pictures of white women will get the FBI on the case in 24 hours. You know, a black boy being shot in the street takes 3 weeks for the FBI to circle around, right? This is sort of, we have to also recognize the society that we're in and the priorities of society. Yes. And so poor people have never been a priority in this country. People of color have never been a priority in this country. And so how do we then make these groups a priority for a substantiated amount of time,
yes.
right? I was really worried about this evening because Ferguson hasn't been in the news in over a week. Mm-hmm. I didn't know if any of you all would show up, right? We've moved past it in the media cycle, right? Until the next big thing comes up, and that could be 2 years. That doesn't mean that the next black child won't be murdered in the next week or two, right? Because we know that it happens every 28 hours. We know that it's been happening every 28 hours for the past 7 years. But when will the next uprising occur? And that's a larger question. And so how do we then sort of keep this in our collective memories and our collective action to sustain us over time is the harder question.
Yes, and that's where your audience wants you to go at this point. The questions, and I'm just going to read off because most of them are revolving around the same sorts of issues. And I'll read them off, and then hopefully you all can respond in kind. What would be the next steps for Ferguson, in your opinion? And I think, Dr. Greer, you were speaking, starting to go in that direction already. What's the relationship of college student action protest, especially if we're apart from home, from communities that are affected? Do you have advice for students? And then how do we change appeasing or quieting language in conversations about racial discrimination? I think that's a much bigger kind of ideological question, but going back to some of the particulars of moving forward, what about blackouts of white-owned businesses, boycotts by blacks as a strategy to change power dynamics? Jump in whenever you're ready.
Make a note. All right, well, as the lone female professor up here, I'll say my piece and then pass it on. Well, as a discussant. I would say, one, don't recreate the wheel. There are, as Dr. Tinson said, there are great organizations who are doing this kind of work. And I think you can find some of them and see what assistance they need, right? And not make assumptions as to what they need. That would be my first. And really finding organizations and supporting them. I think going with the boycott question, what I've made a commitment to do is to really support grassroots organizations. Yes, NPR needs my money. Yes, the American Cancer Society needs my money, but so does FEARS. Right? So does Project South. So does Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, right? These are organizations where if they don't get $50, they actually might have to shut down, right? These are organizations that are really supporting youth. They're supporting poor people. And your $5 a month could actually go a much longer way, in my opinion, than some of the larger organizations that you all may support. And really think about philanthropy not as, you know, I have to be a millionaire before I start giving money, right? If you don't have $5 a month to give, that's okay, but you can find an organization to give your time. There are organizations in Holyoke and Springfield that Dr. Tinson works with. You can take a bus. Right? There are other ways where you can finance the revolution, however you define revolution. I'll let you guys take it.
I think the other piece too is every single city has a police force, and every single one of them needs to be studied. And look at the grievances that have been listed, look at their record of policing, and if they've done a good job, however you describe a good job, then, you know, they can get props. And if they haven't by those standards, then we need to call them out. And we need to ask for greater accountability and greater transparency and a sense of shared governance. People should have a say in how they're governed. And that's what supposedly the country is built on. But the state and the apparatuses that control power don't necessarily want to share that. They don't necessarily share that. In fact, the guy that I've been mentioning in my remarks tonight, Riorda, who's the business manager for the STL, St. Louis Police Association, he's also a state representative in Missouri. He has been blocking a bill that calls for the releasing of officers' names who've been involved in the shooting. So he's actually actively blocking legislation that would actually empower the governed, that would actually empower the citizens of Ferguson and St. Louis and the surrounding counties. And if it happens in St. Louis, then it's going to happen in the rest of the municipalities. St. Louis is like the big brother on the block in that area. So if it happens there, it can happen in many municipalities that affect places like Ferguson. But when you have elected officials who are trying to block transparency, then it's our responsibility to really call that out and show that we demand some accountability and we demand transparency. And that's the most effective form of showing our citizenship, is really putting it in their face that we demand transparency and that we have to do it for more than just 4 years. So you can't graduate from this struggle. This is not a struggle that your diploma says it's over now, right? You have to continue this work wherever you go. And the people who continue this work are the people who are going to be on the front lines when the next incident happens. So each one teach one. That's my motto.
So I think we have a lot that we can take with us to think about and mobilize ourselves into action. As Dean Walters suggested earlier, Jennifer Walters suggested earlier, we're going to be continuing these sorts of conversations throughout the year. Hopefully we can get some students involved in mobilizing some action that might be able to be involved in organizations down in Holyoke and Springfield. We'd hope to be able to have a community member or someone who works with the community in Springfield here on the panel, but they had a conflict. So we want you to know that we're very interested in working with the community and our community and communities near us. But we want to take a moment to thank each of our panelists for being here this evening and sharing such a wealth of knowledge. I hope that you've been taking notes and getting information about these organizations, and also just, you know, taking some of the tidbits, remembering to ask questions, remembering to make connections, pay attention to history, because as Professor Roberts said, there's nothing new. All of this is something that, these are things that we've been dealing with for quite some time. So thank yous to